Hi, welcome to the next episode of Bones and Stones. Today we have Mduduzi Maseko with us. Mduduzi is a lecturer at the University of South Africa. And not too long ago, he completed his master's and he's now started his PhD. And we're going to chat a bit about his research linked to his master's and the ongoing work that he's busy conducting. How's it, Mduduzi? Welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us. We appreciate it. Maybe we can just kick things off by, could you give us a bit of a breakdown around what your master's was about and what you looked at and what you found?
Thanks very much, guys, for having me on the show finally. I suppose second time if you count that other episode that we all did. But yeah, thank you for having me. So just to give a bit of a background on my research or what I do as an archaeologist so far in my career. I started doing archaeological research, working with Sam Chalice and Jeff Blundell in the Northeastern Cape. And if you look at the work of those guys and what they've been doing in the discipline so far in their careers is looking at different identities in the South African archaeological record, or the complexity of identity, and sort of challenging these colonial narratives of what South Africa is, or looking at diversity in a more of a post-colonial way as compared to what anthropologists and archaeologists have been saying in the past. And so coming from that background is I sort of took that influence and brought it to this new study area in Mpumalanga when I started working with Alex Skuman and David Pearce. So basically the project was just, we're going to go into this area and I'll record everything that is all rock art sites that are in this area, for conservation purposes and just for awareness. Because this is an area that no one has ever worked in before. I mean, there have been some sporadic research in the past 55 years, but a lot of that is now outdated or it wasn't done properly. For instance, there's a lot of research right now in Mpumalanga on farming communities in the last 500 years or so, but there's virtually no knowledge of what the hunter-gatherer peoples were doing in the last 2,000 years or whatever period. So that's what the core of the master's project was. And again, coming from that background, what I started noticing is that that narrative of we need to look at identity in a new way, I felt like that was missing from this particular area, which I call the Gomatiligo study area. It's between Ermelo, Bethel, Carolina, and Lake Chrissie. And if you guys know anything about Lake Chrissie, it's been associated with San descendant groups in the last 50 years or so that were still living in those areas. There's a lot of research that's been done on them, anthropological research, but that as well is very problematic, especially if you're looking into doing archaeological research in this area. And again, it goes back to challenging these colonial views. So with that kind of background, what was most interesting to me and what the master's eventually became about is looking at the diversity of the rock art in this area. That was the most interesting to me, and which in most places are understood as different rock art traditions that were made by different ethnic groups. But what I was finding in this area is that it's not as clear-cut as it has been made to seem, and that there's a lot of blending between these different traditions, whether it's chronological overlaps, which that's another issue that we'll talk about later, but what is chronological overlap? So it's these different styles that are blending to sort of form a new, not really tradition, but it's a blend that is sometimes site specific, and you can't really pin it into these different traditions. You can't really categorize it. That was the challenge, and that's what really the master's was about.
So what I found really interesting, some of this art that you found It's obviously art that is very poorly understood in the area. Actually, some of it very poorly understood across Southern Africa. We're still coming to grips with a lot of it, and obviously some of it, in a very typical way, might pinpoint some identities that we might generally associate this art with. But you kind of took that and challenged that slightly. Can you just chat a bit about how you use the art to challenge some of the ways that we construct identities in the sort of Stone Age past?
Yeah. So I mean, I feel like it's the very beginning of what is going to be a long project in this area, because there's a lot that is still debated in archaeology. There are no answers as yet, right? So mostly my master's is just bringing up questions about how we need to think about these things. So for instance, I have some sites that have finger painted geometric paintings. I have sites that have brush painted geometric paintings, which is something that you almost never see in the South African archaeological record. And how we've been made to believe in the past is, if you see finger painted geometric art, Khoi people must have made that. Definitely it was the Khoi. There's this whole constant debate and whatnot. Fine line paintings, that immediately means sun painting. And what I'm saying in this dissertation is we really need to change the way we think about these things. We need to sort of look at the rock art as a record in itself. What is it telling us about history? Should we stick to these categories that really are made by us as researchers, or should we take it as something to learn from?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's been discussions from Dowson and Ben Smith and a number of people around using art in a sort of historical sense and bringing historicism to the study of rock art. And in a place like this sort of landscape where you have these identities that are there that we don't have a firm grip on, it'd be great to be able to do that with the rock art and understand a lot better. I imagine one of the challenges you face is not in terms of the art, but in terms of the sequence of this landscape, is chronology. Have there been any excavations in that area that give us a good sense of chronology?
Yes and no. So first excavations that were done in this area were done by Schoonrod and some other people, and was in the late 60s. First publication, I think, was 1971 by Schoonrod. And since then, there hasn't been really any I think there were excavations, but there hasn't been anything that's published. So we don't really have a clear record of what is there, especially in terms of the chronology. So that was one of my challenges in trying to fit these different traditions or whatnot into chronology. For instance, when did this geometric arts come into this area? That is a very big challenge. And that's sort of what my PhD will be looking at, is trying to go back to these sites and try to start excavations in this area. Because if I don't do it, who else will, so yeah, so it's still something that still needs to be done. There is no clear chronology for this area, yeah.
And so when the time comes to get down there, excavate, get some nice dates for some of these sequences up, do you think that chronology might assist with understanding who may be the producers of the art as well? Obviously, there's an inference that needs to be made, but do you think that's going to assist in some way in trying to figure this out?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think right now there's no way of telling, but obviously, it's very difficult to integrate, excavated archaeology with rock art, and a lot has been written about that. I think David Whittleson did a presentation on that at the Last Supper as well. So yeah, it's a difficult thing to do, but it's a challenge that I'm willing to take on. And I hope will at least give some answers. At least as a start, try to find a sequence and then see what we can build from that. Yeah.
Mduduzi, I have a question for you. First of all, thanks for coming on the show and discussing your research. This is very, very fascinating. You've come a long way since last I met you when you were a first year in archaeology, and it's great to see you doing great things in the field. Just a very quick question from me. So this area in Mpumalanga seems like it's fairly important, it's fairly interesting, it's fairly unique for its rock art record. And I'm just wondering why do you think there has been very little research done in this area on these topics in specific? Is there maybe some sort of like research bias? Is it just lack of interest? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it could be lack of interest. I really can't say what it is. I think for Stone Age research, for instance, a lot of people are focusing in Southern Cape or the Northeastern Cape for rock art studies, and in as a consequence, this area was neglected. I think Mpumalanga in general, the rock art of Mpumalanga in general, whether you're looking at rock paintings or you're looking at engravings. So I think Tim Meggs wrote a paper in 1995 talking about this specific thing, that rock art in Mpumalanga was neglected, and he was talking about rock engravings at that time. And even that, I mean, when was it last time you saw publication on the rock engravings of Mpumalanga, which there are a lot of them, by the way. So yeah, it might be research bias. It might be because a lot of people that are archaeologists that are interested in Mpumalanga are more interested in the stone wall circles or the farming archaeology, which that is fine as well. But there's just not been anyone who's willing to initiate a project in these areas. And thankfully for Alex Kuman, who brought me on the project. So my research was a part of her project to say, we need to add more to the narrative.
Mduduzi, just so to bring it a little bit more forward in time, because we're talking about ancestral San communities. We use the term San in inverted commas, but there have been historic studies in the area by Potgieter into the Lake Cressy San communities that were living around there. Can you tell us a bit about those communities that were still around in the historic period? Because I'm assuming there was a bit of ethnography collected on them and a bit more information that we have available to us about this community.
Yeah. So the problem with anthropological work that was done with those communities, I suppose portrait is more useful studies. But most of the research that was done on those communities was very, very problematic, racist at the least. So you find studies about increasing stature, or these Bushmen are shorter than those Bushmen, or these Bushmen are darker than those Bushmen. So you find such descriptions in literature, light skin versus dark skin, tall versus short. So that's the difficulty of using that as an ethnographic record is because of what their research agenda was. But with Potgieter, which is like the key anthropological study that was done here, he managed to also record, their belief systems, their oral history, and that's I tried to integrate some of that into the project that I did, and see if we can, use some of it to understand the rock art, or at least the peopling of this area. So these were. Okay, the complexity again is chronology, I suppose, and how the history of this area is not very understood. So you have these people that were recorded in the 1950s, and most writers are saying these are people that came from other parts of the country, that came from Lesotho, that came from Free State and Northeastern Cape. But again, if you look at that oral history that was collected by Potgieter, you're talking about certain places on this very same landscape where their ancestors told them certain stories about, magical things, so you have things about stories about rainmaking on this landscape. You have stories about so-called taming magic that is specifically linked to this landscape. So what I think happened is those various groups that have been in this area that are not in the written records, and then the other groups that obviously came in after the 1870s and have a clear historical record of that. And the misconception is people take that and assume that, you know, there were no hunter-gatherers on this landscape before the 1870s. And I suppose that's part of, you know, retracing that colonial narrative, because that's really what it is.
That's interesting. I mean, it's also, I mean, the community that lived there, the San community there, it's quite a unique situation to have a community living in such a manner so late into the 20th century compared to other areas. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but Potgieter did his work, I think it was 1955 or somewhere around there. And to have that kind of record on that landscape is quite fascinating. So in terms of your research, what's the next step now? Obviously, we've chatted about this a bit, but for the benefit of our listeners, what's the next step?
As I said, the next step is going back to this area. Hopefully, eventually, I'll get more people to jump on. So obviously, you are going to be part of that project. But I can't say much about it yet because it's you know, it's a proposal I'm still writing, so I don't really have a clear plan yet. But essentially, what I want to do is go back to this area and excavate some of the sites and establish a chronology and, you know, try to bring some archaeological evidence into some of the things that I say in dissertation, some of which are, you know, just theoretical rather than based on the actual archaeology, which is currently missing. So yeah, that's the next step.
And then, you know, in terms of looking at the archaeology that you've seen in your masters and talking about this landscape as kind of being a place that people haven't really paid a lot of attention to through the work and you know, the research you're going to do on this landscape. Do you think it's going to, I mean, it's probably, I'm sure it's a question full of conjecture right now, but do you think it's going to start to alter the way we think about peopling of this region, peopling of that part of Southern Africa in terms of herders, hunter-gatherers, these different subsistence bases? Or do you think it's going to more or less sort of follow in line with what we found in other areas, but just develop the argument because it's a landscape we haven't really considered?
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I say in the dissertation is that as much as Mpumalanga is a part of the South African or Southern African landscape, we really need to think about the history of this area in local terms. So focus on what is actually going on in this area in its own right, you know, and then you can compare it with other places. So I think there's a lot of potential for archaeological findings. I think that there's a lot of stuff that will come up from this area that we don't yet know about in the South African archaeological record, or just from Mpumalanga. I think a new narrative is going to come out. So, for instance, I mentioned earlier that geometric paintings in this area, which some of them are brush painted, some of them are finger painted, and that's something that you don't see in most places in South Africa. So that's one of the questions. Were the herders in this area in the past? Does the presence of geometric paintings mean that there were herders, or is it something else more complex than that? But obviously the challenge is, again, goes back to the debates identifying herder material culture in the archaeological record, again, apart from just the rock art.
Yeah, that's not easy to do. Finding herders stuff, it's notorious.
Mm-hmm.
So we take a sort of just the last question around your project. If we take a step back, and you mentioned that you got brought into this project with Alex Skuman and her work in the area. So how did your work feed into, well, I guess it's a two-part question. How did your work feed into the research they were doing on the farmer sequence of the landscape? And in that farmer history, is there any mention or any knowledge or any stories related to the rock art sequence that you were looking at?
Okay, so as much as my project was a part of Alex's research which has been going on for years in this area. It's not exactly in the same area. The two areas overlap. So the area I'm looking at is a bit south of where she's working. So it's not exactly in Bugoni where she works. It's south of Bugoni. So initially I called the area Southern Bugoni, but because of associations with that name, you'll think that I'm focusing on what has been published about Bugoni before. But there's no clear correlation between what is happening in Bugoni and what is happening down south. I think particularly because you're looking at two different things. One, in Bugoni, they're focusing, on the farmer sequence and what farming communities were doing there. And what I was focusing on in this area is, the forager landscape, and which again is not very clear as yet. So, I mean, there may have been interactions between, people in this landscape and people up north, but that's something that we just don't yet have a record of.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting. I think there's a lot of interesting prospects here, and like it's almost like what's the term? Like it's sort of open fields. There's so much you can do. There's so many possibilities, and hopefully there's a lot of really great research that comes out of this. Matt, I see you've got a question. Matt, you're on mute.
Sorry for that.
It was better that way.
My neighbors are busy banging and crashing. Mduduzi, thanks very much. This has been really interesting so far. Sorry, Tim took the words out of my mouth. I was thinking about asking a question very similar to what he was asking in terms of how Alex's work on Bokoni, for example, then fits in with what you're doing. But maybe if I could bring it back to the rock art, and you spoke about the differences in the traditions. You spoke about the brush geometrics, which you don't get anywhere else. You've got the geometrics as well. And now you're obviously looking at these ancestral sand communities, but maybe more an observation and less so a question, but it really seems like this landscape was one of cultural fluidity, at least in terms of identities. It seemed like there were lots of groups on the landscape, definitely the possibility of some kind of interactions. And maybe that talks to the fact that you've got such unique art. So again, just an observation, but then more a question, possibly for your PhD. Are you planning to stay focused in this area, which you're currently working on now, or is there the possibility to look at rock art sites elsewhere in Mpumalanga? Because obviously we do know that they are there, they are poorly studied, and more work needs to be done. So where do you kind of see your work going, perhaps even beyond the PhD?
Yeah, so first, I totally agree with what you said. It was a dynamic landscape, with different identities, and that's really what I'm getting to. The only problem is so far we only have the rock art as a record of these possible identities that were in the landscape, and that is not enough to actually say something about this area, because just because the rock art is this diverse doesn't really confirm that there were these specific identities. But yeah, definitely it was a diverse landscape, I believe. And then for my PhD, I'm focusing in the same area. I would love to do to look at rock art in other parts of Mpumalanga. I actually grew up in Mpumalanga. I'm from there, so I've been finding sites, back home as well, where I'm from, but not specifically for any study. So for the PhD, I'm focusing on this exact same area. And hopefully in the future, I could expand that project to look at the entire province, as soon as I get more people on the project to jump on, more people who are, for instance, interested in the Middle Stone Age of this area, which again, we know nothing about. So yeah.
It's an
Just with regards to,
sorry,
Tim, I'm just going to say with regards to the Middle Stone Age, you could speak to Matt Caruana about that. I know he's got a special place in his heart for the Middle Stone Age. But
I wonder if anyone will ever find that special place.
Yeah,
I certainly have not. I certainly have not. I've not found that special place. It's probably in there somewhere, but very, very, very far down.
So,
yeah.
Matt, I wanted to just make like what the point you've raised, and I think something that Mduduzi's touched on in his research and looked at is it's a really interesting thing. This potential for looking at this imbrication of these different identities, and if you look at some of the historic records, one of the things I found fascinating is how flexible hunter-gatherer communities are in terms of shifting their survival behaviors. Bringing in livestock at different times, and then when that disappears, when rinderpest hits, or when other opportunities fade away, they're able to shift back into different ways of being. And on a landscape like this, with art that at least has some indicators that there's this sort of cross-pollination of identities being represented in this art, it would be great to start to tackle that. However, actually being able to really show that is tough. I mean, we still don't even agree fully that finger painted geometrics is 100% Khoi. There's still a big discussion around that. So yeah, it's exciting, and it does tap into some really beautiful questions around identity and the construction of identities. But it's going to be a tough task, that's for sure.
Yep. Well, thankfully I have you to help me with that.
I might cause more problems than help. Who knows? Anyway, guys, I think we should wrap it up there. Thanks, Mduduzi, for joining us. Really interesting. It's been great, reading up on your work and chatting about it now. And I look forward to doing more work with you. Looking forward to getting down to your research area in the coming weeks as well and seeing some of the sites. But we appreciate it. Good luck with the rest of the semester. We wanted to chat a bit about UNISA and your transition into being a lecturer, but we'll have to save that for another time, I guess. But good luck, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mduduzi.
Thank you.